Well, look, we're here for this is an educational series. Okay, we're trying to learn about the nickel market. We're trying to understand what it's used for. What the future could look like. So you're helping us with that. So in the past couple of weeks, we've looked at the EV thematic and why nickel's important to that. We've also last week realized that actually stainless steel is a much bigger component for nickel. But there's still more. There's a few more uses, and it might be worth covering those off. So why don't you sort of skip us through some of the other uses perhaps most people aren't aware of?
Yeah, sure. So, I think to date, again, EV is the future and the stainless is the as is, and 2/3 of nickel consumption now is stainless steel. 5% or so is the EV market, and that's going to grow very, very substantially over the next 15 years. But there's about 30% of the current uses, which have a sort of fairly diverse set of uses, and they're each roughly sort of 10-ish% each. So the first one, and this has been a very sort of strong source of growth long term, is with sort of category called high nickel alloys, and so. In stainless steel, you use about 8%. The main nickel stainless steel uses about 8% nickel. In high nickel alloys, you're looking to use materials where you've got 15, 20, 25, 30, 50, 60, 70% nickel in them. And again, you're alloying them with things like cobalt and molybdenum and chromium and iron. And what you're trying to achieve is, a set of properties in terms of strength, in terms of being able to have strength at very high temperatures, be able to stand a lot of pressure, be super corrosion resistant, and in some cases, have some certain magnetic properties because, those there. So, that's what, high nickel alloys are. So anytime you're sitting in a jet airplane and you look out the window, those jet engines next to you, have a couple tons of nickel in them because those nickel alloys are the most durable alloys for use in those type of applications. Obviously, that's a good source of, historically, it's been a great source of demand because, airlines aren't going to change the alloys they use to save $2. It's a pretty extensive permitting process to permit an engine and permit the materials that can be used in an engine. So that's always been a very sort of non-price sensitive source of demand for nickel. Obviously, with COVID and the collapse in travel, that's going to, that sector has been really hit hard over the last 4 or 5 months. Another area where those go into is in oil and gas. So again, both of those areas. So high nickel alloys for the last 10 years has been a sort of pretty strong, robust source of growth and is actually going through a lot of pain. I know one of your talkers talked about the cobalt market and talked about sort of the world of pain cobalt's in. And because again, cobalt is commonly alloyed with nickel in these types of applications. So except it's a much bigger part of the cobalt market than it is the nickel market. So, that's why cobalt's getting disproportionately hit there. So that's one sector, high nickel alloys. The next one is alloy steel. And so, again, this is areas where you're not necessarily creating stainless steel per se, but you're looking to throw a few percentage points or, again, up to 10 or 20% of nickel to get some specific properties. Again, just make it a little stronger, a little more. It won't. There's one common alloy that doesn't change size based on temperature very much, and again, places where you want things to be a little magnetic. So, they mix a little nickel in. So again, that group of applications is roughly 10% of the market. And the last sector, which has kind of been shrinking over time, is the plating market. That used to be a super big application back in the 60s. And 70s, and is sort of moved around the world in different locations as plating is not necessarily the most environmentally sensitive process. So it's unfortunately migrated to places that have the lowest regulation from time to time. But again, if you think of big cars from the 1960s with great big chrome plated bumpers, even though they're called chrome plated, that plating is actually a series of layers of chrome and nickel. Which make it resistant to rust. And so things like shopping carts and all kinds of things, wherever you saw chrome plating, there is a little bit of nickel in that application. Now, with the big spike in nickel prices we saw back in the mid 2000s, people really don't care whether their shopping cart is chrome plated. And so, those applications tended to get shifted over to other non-nickel uses at that time. So now most shopping carts are basically coated with some sort of plastic or other sort of non-metal coating to be able to sort of make them corrosion resistant enough for the underlying iron that they're made of. And so again, this is an application that's kind of 5 or 10% of the market. So they're there. They're not the big story, but they continue to have from time to time influences in terms of where metal demand's going. So I thought it'd be good just to sort of round out, so you now have the entire 100% of the demand pie.
That's fantastic. But people are looking to, obviously, stainless steel actually explained last week. It's huge. That's not going to change anytime soon. And the market we've just talked about today, being high nickel alloy and alloy steel and plating, that's not a growing sector as such. The growth demand is all coming from EV.
Yeah, that's correct. And again, right now, the high nickel alloy sector, because of its dependence on aircraft and oil and gas, has been a sort of a drag on overall demand growth over the last 6 to 12 months.
Right. Okay. That's interesting. I mean, that does kind of help us understand where nickel is being used. And there's no kind of new applications for nickel. Nickel's just looking 100% at EV and saying that's where we want to play.
Yeah, for sure. That's the current big source of new demand. One little one-off piece. There were some stories this week where people had patented a nickel-coated air filter, or not nickel-coated, sorry, a nickel alloy air filter, where you basically sort of put it into air conditioned air circulation units in commercial buildings, and so as the air gets pulled through, they basically zap the COVID viruses that are in the air. And the reason they're using nickel is you can heat up this filter so that it gets hot enough that if the COVID touches it, it kills it. And a lot of metals, if you heat them up, it causes them to corrode more quickly. In this case, the nickel prevents them from corroding too quickly. So we'll see whether that becomes an application. But it was sort of an interesting, just to highlight sort of nickel has a lot of properties that make it very, very widely used in a bunch of different applications.
Okay, I'm not going to follow up on that one, because that's everyone is trying to come up with a way that they can get on the COVID bandwagon for funding. So I'm not. The headline won't be nickel cures COVID. But it is kind of amazing, because I think we also had a guy talking about copper this week, and he was talking about the long-held health benefits of copper as a potential market, which is, I think, is well understood. People drinking from copper cups and copper bracelets and so forth, but it's probably not going to drive the market, I think, and I suspect neither will these air filters.